Every barrel of oil sold anywhere on Earth is priced in US dollars. Not because of geography, not because of any international law or treaty, because of a deal struck in secret between the United States government and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in the summer of 1974. The man who made that deal was Henry Kissinger. The problem he was solving was one of the most serious in American economic history, a problem that had been building for 30 years, that had finally broken open in August 1971, and that threatened to end the United States' position as the dominant power in the global economy. The solution Kissinger found was so elegant and so audacious that it is worth spending 20 minutes understanding precisely how it worked, because it still works. Right now, today, the arrangement made in Riyadh in 1974 is the invisible architecture beneath the entire global financial system. And it is, for the first time in 50 years, under serious pressure. The petrodollar system is the reason the United States can run a permanent trade deficit, borrow at low interest rates, and impose economic sanctions on any country in the world. It is not an accident. It was designed. Welcome to Macro Atlas. This is the story of America's most powerful and least understood financial arrangement. Chapter 1. Bretton Woods, the architecture that preceded the deal. To understand 1944, you must understand 1940, and to understand 1940, you must understand the problem that the Second World War left on the table for the people who won it. The war had destroyed the monetary architecture of the previous century. The gold standard, the system by which each national currency was backed by a fixed quantity of gold, had collapsed under the strain of wartime spending. Countries had printed money to fund the conflict. The fixed gold backing had become impossible to maintain. By 1944, there was no functioning international monetary system. Trade between nations required a new foundation. In July 1944, delegates from 44 Allied nations met at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design that foundation. The American economist Henry Dexter White and the British economist John Maynard Keynes, the same Keynes who had resigned from Versailles in protest 25 years earlier, proposed competing visions. Keynes wanted a new international currency, the Bancor, managed by a supranational institution. White wanted the US dollar. White won. The Bretton Woods Agreement established the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. Every other currency would be pegged to the dollar at a fixed exchange rate. The dollar itself would be pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. Any country holding dollars could, in theory, exchange them for gold at that rate from the U.S. Federal Reserve. This arrangement worked because, in 1944, the United States held approximately 70% of the world's monetary gold reserves. It had emerged as the dominant industrial economy, the primary creditor nation, and the only major power whose physical infrastructure had not been bombed into rubble. The dollar's gold backing was credible because America's gold supply was real and enormous. For 25 years, Bretton Woods delivered unprecedented global economic stability. The post-war reconstruction of Europe and Japan, funded partly by American loans and the Marshall Plan, created new trading partners for American industry. Global trade expanded at rates not seen since the pre-war era. The dollar was the world's money, and the world was broadly content with that arrangement. Chapter 2. The problem accumulates. The problem with Bretton Woods was structural. If the dollar was to function as the world's reserve currency, the United States had to supply the world with dollars. And the only way to supply the world with dollars was to run a trade deficit, to import more than it exported, paying the difference in dollars that then circulated in foreign central banks and treasuries as reserves. But the more dollars circulated internationally, the more the question arose,
Was the United States really holding enough gold to honor the promise to exchange dollars for gold at $35 per ounce? By the late 1960s, the answer was increasingly no. American spending on the Vietnam War and Johnson's Great Society programs had expanded the money supply without a corresponding increase in gold reserves. Foreign central banks, particularly France under Charles de Gaulle, began converting their dollar reserves into gold, drawing down American reserves at an alarming rate. De Gaulle was explicit and theatrical about his objections. He called the dollar's reserve status an exorbitant privilege, a phrase coined by his finance minister, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, that has circulated in economic literature ever since. France converted $300 million of dollar reserves into gold in 1965 and sent a battleship to New York to collect the physical metal. By 1971, the position was untenable. American gold reserves had fallen from their post-war peak of $25 billion to approximately $10 billion. Foreign governments held dollar claims of over $80 billion. The promise to exchange dollars for gold at $35 per ounce was a fiction that everyone could see through. U.S. gold reserves 1944, $25 billion, 70% of world total. U.S. gold reserves 1971, $10 billion. Foreign dollar claims 1971, $80+ billion. The gap, the promise could not be kept. On the evening of Sunday, August 15, 1971, President Nixon appeared on national television and announced that the United States was suspending the convertibility of the dollar into gold. Effective immediately, the dollar was no longer backed by anything except the full faith and credit of the United States government. The Bretton Woods system, the monetary architecture of the post-war world, was over. Nixon's announcement lasted 18 minutes. It ended 30 years of monetary order and began a crisis that Kissinger had approximately 3 years to solve before the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency became genuinely uncertain. Chapter 3: The Crisis That Created the Opportunity. In October 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated military attack on Israel. The United States resupplied Israel with military equipment. In retaliation, the Arab members of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, announced an oil embargo against the United States and other countries that had supported Israel. They simultaneously cut production and raised prices. The effect on the American economy was immediate and severe. Oil prices quadrupled from approximately $3 per barrel to $12 per barrel within months. Petrol rationing was introduced. Queues at filling stations stretched for city blocks. The American economy, which had been built on cheap energy since the Second World War, went into shock. For the Nixon administration, already destabilized by Watergate, this was a crisis with two dimensions. The first was the immediate economic pain. The second was strategic. The oil embargo demonstrated that the United States' access to the energy that powered its economy was at the discretion of foreign governments it had limited leverage over. Henry Kissinger, serving simultaneously as National Security Advisor and Secretary of State, a concentration of foreign policy power unprecedented in American history, identified in this crisis the solution to the dollar problem. The connection was not obvious. It required a specific kind of strategic imagination to see it.
Chapter 4: The Riyadh Meeting, June and July 1974. In June and July 1974, U.S. Treasury Secretary William Simon and his deputy Jerry Parsky made 2 visits to Saudi Arabia. The meetings were not publicly disclosed at the time. The arrangement they negotiated was kept classified for decades. Its details were only confirmed when Bloomberg News obtained the relevant documents through Freedom of Information requests in 2016. The deal had 2 components.
The first was American military and security guarantees to the Saudi royal family, weapons sales, military training, protection against external threats and internal instability. For a monarchy sitting on the world's largest oil reserves, surrounded by hostile neighbors, and facing the perpetual threat of revolution, this was an offer of existential value. The second component was the economic arrangement. Saudi Arabia would price its oil exports exclusively in U.S. dollars. It would invest the revenues, the enormous surplus of dollars generated by oil sales at the new post-embargo prices, back into U.S. Treasury bonds and other dollar-denominated assets. Saudi Arabia would not publicize the size or composition of these investments, and it would use its influence within OPEC to encourage other members to adopt the same dollar pricing convention. In exchange, the United States would guarantee that Saudi Arabia's dollar investments were safe, liquid, and earning a reasonable return. It would not inflate away the value of those investments, and it would maintain the military architecture that protected the Saudi state. Chapter 5. The Mechanism. Why it worked. The genius of the petrodollar arrangement, and it was genuinely brilliant, whatever one thinks of its ethics, lay in a simple chain of logic that created structural demand for the U.S. dollar, regardless of America's trade balance, inflation rate, or gold reserves. Here is the chain. Every country in the world needs oil. Oil is priced in dollars. Therefore, every country in the world needs dollars to buy oil. To hold dollars reliably, countries accumulate dollar reserves, U.S. Treasury bonds, dollar-denominated assets, dollar cash. This demand for dollar reserves means the United States can issue Treasury debt at lower interest rates than would otherwise be possible, because there is a structural global buyer. Lower interest rates mean lower borrowing costs for the American government and American businesses. Lower borrowing costs mean the United States can run a trade deficit indefinitely, importing more than it exports, without the currency depreciation that would normally follow. The petrodollar system solved the Nixon problem by replacing gold with oil. The dollar no longer needed to be backed by a physical commodity held in a vault. It was backed by a commodity that every country on earth needed to buy, and that could only be purchased in dollars. The recycling of petrodollars completed the circle. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states earned hundreds of billions of dollars from oil sales. Those dollars had to go somewhere. They were recycled, invested in U.S. Treasury bonds, American real estate, Wall Street assets. This inflow of foreign capital into American financial markets kept American interest rates low and American asset prices high. The oil exporting countries earned a return. The United States got cheap financing. The system was self-reinforcing.
Chapter 6. The Exorbitant Privilege. Giscard d'Estaing's phrase, the exorbitant privilege, described the dollar's reserve status in 1965. By the 1980s and 1990s, with the petrodollar system fully operational, it barely covered the advantage America actually held. Consider what the petrodollar arrangement enabled. The United States could run a permanent trade deficit, importing far more than it exported, without the currency crises that would normally force a correction. Between 1980 and 2024, the United States ran a trade deficit in every single year. In 2023, the deficit was $773 billion. A country with a normal currency doing this would face depreciation, inflation, and a forced reduction in living standards. The United States faced none of these consequences because foreign countries kept accumulating the dollars the deficit produced. The United States could borrow money cheaply. The 10-year U.S. Treasury bond, the benchmark for American government borrowing, has historically yielded less than equivalent bonds issued by other developed economies because global demand for dollar assets is structural rather than discretionary.
This lower borrowing cost saves the American government hundreds of billions of dollars annually in interest payments. American companies could expand globally without currency risk. American tourists could travel the world with a currency accepted everywhere. American banks could operate at the center of the global financial system because that system was denominated in their currency. Chapter 7. The Weapon. But the most consequential privilege the petrodollar system conferred was one that took decades to become fully visible: the ability to weaponize financial access. The dollar's centrality to global trade and finance means that any entity, any bank, any company, any government that needs to conduct transactions in dollars must have access to the U.S. financial system. The primary infrastructure of that system is SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, a Belgian-based messaging network through which banks communicate international payment instructions. Virtually every significant international financial transaction passes through SWIFT. The United States discovered in the years after 2001 that it could use access to this infrastructure as a weapon. By sanctioning entities, cutting them off from the dollar financial system, from SWIFT access, from the ability to conduct transactions in the world's reserve currency, Washington could impose severe economic damage without firing a single shot. Iran was cut off from SWIFT in 2012, collapsing the Riyadh and triggering severe economic contraction. Russia's central bank reserves, $300 billion of dollar and euro assets, were frozen following the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea, the list of countries that have experienced the weaponization of dollar dominance is long. The dollar is not just America's currency. It is America's foreign policy instrument, its deterrent, and its most powerful lever of coercive power. The country that controls the world's reserve currency controls, to a significant degree, the world's financial nervous system. This power, exercised repeatedly and against an expanding list of targets, has produced a predictable consequence. The countries most likely to be sanctioned have spent the past decade building alternatives to dollar dependence, and some of those countries are very large.
Chapter 8. The Saudi Bargain. What it cost. The petrodollar deal was not free. The United States paid for Saudi Arabia's cooperation, and the currency was not dollars. The American security umbrella over Saudi Arabia, and by extension over the Gulf states, committed the United States to military involvement in a region of chronic instability. The first Gulf War in 1991 was fought partly to preserve the territorial integrity of Kuwait and the security of Saudi Arabia and its oil infrastructure. Hundreds of thousands of American troops were deployed to the region. The permanent American military presence, bases, naval fleets, air power, represented an ongoing commitment of resources and credibility. The permanent American military presence in Saudi Arabia, in turn, became one of the primary grievances cited by Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda as the justification for the September 11th attacks. The petrodollar arrangement, in this reading, contributed to the conditions that produced the most catastrophic terrorist attack in American history and the subsequent wars in Afghanistan and Iraq that cost trillions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of lives. That is not a simple moral calculation. The petrodollar system also funded American prosperity and global stability for 50 years. But it is a reminder that financial arrangements of this kind do not exist in isolation. They have geopolitical costs that can be severe, diffuse, and impossible to fully anticipate at the time the deal is made. Chapter 9. The De-Dollarization Question. In March 2023, Saudi Arabia announced that it was open to settling oil trades in currencies other than the U.S. dollar. The announcement was brief, carefully worded, and diplomatically understated. Its implications were not. In 2022, Russia and China settled a significant portion of their bilateral trade in yuan rather than dollars. Brazil and China struck a currency swap agreement to conduct trade in their own currencies. The BRICS group, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, now expanded to include Saudi Arabia, Iran, and others, has been developing proposals for a new reserve currency or payment system that would reduce dependence on the dollar. These developments are real. They are also, at present, modest. The dollar still accounts for approximately 58% of global foreign exchange reserves, down from 71% in 2000, but still the dominant single currency by a large margin. The euro accounts for 20%. The yuan accounts for approximately 2 to 3%. The infrastructure of de-dollarization exists, but its scale is still small relative to the incumbent system. Dollar share of global FX reserves 2000 to 71%. Dollar share of global FX reserves 2024 to 58%. Yuan share of global FX reserves 2024 to 2.5%. Dollar share of global trade invoicing 2024 to 54%. Dollar share of SWIFT transactions 2024 to 42%. The most serious structural challenge to dollar dominance is not the yuan. It is the repeated use of dollar weaponization, sanctions, asset freezes, exclusion from SWIFT that has caused every country observing from the outside to ask, could this happen to us? The answer, for any country that has a foreign policy Washington disagrees with, is yes, it could.
Chapter 10. What would replace it? The honest answer to what would replace the dollar system is nobody knows, and the transition, if it comes, would be managed rather than sudden. Reserve currency transitions have happened before. The British pound's displacement by the dollar took roughly 40 years, from the 1920s to the 1960s. They are disruptive but not apocalyptic. The more interesting question is what the United States would look like without the exorbitant privilege. Without the structural global demand for dollars, the U.S. government would face higher borrowing costs, potentially significantly higher. The trade deficit would need to shrink, meaning American consumers would need to buy less of the foreign goods they currently import cheaply. The ability to sanction would diminish as alternative payment systems matured. None of this is imminent. The dollar's network effects, the fact that its dominance is self-reinforcing because everyone uses it because everyone else uses it, are genuinely powerful. Displacing a network currency requires a coordination problem that no alternative has yet solved. But the petrodollar deal was made by one man in one meeting in a city most Americans had never heard of in 1974. The arrangement that structures the entire global financial system was not inevitable, it was constructed. And constructed things can be reconstructed or dismantled if the incentives change. The petrodollar was designed to solve a specific problem in a specific moment. The problem it solved was real. The moment has lasted 50 years. Whether it lasts 50 more depends on whether the arrangement still serves the interests of both parties, and that, for the first time since 1974, is genuinely uncertain. Chapter 11. The Answer. Why does Saudi Arabia price its oil in U.S. dollars? Because in 1974, Henry Kissinger and William Simon flew to Riyadh and made a deal: security guarantees and weapons in exchange for dollar pricing and recycled petro surplus. A bilateral arrangement between two governments that became the invisible architecture of the global financial system. That deal was not an accident of history. It was not the natural outcome of market forces. It was a specific, deliberate, secret construction built to solve a specific problem in a specific moment by people who understood what they were doing and chose to do it anyway. The series of episodes you have watched in this series, Singapore's institutional design, Botswana's diamond governance, Qatar's visibility strategy, Weimar's monetary catastrophe, all of them take place inside a financial system whose architecture was built in that Riyadh meeting. Every central bank that holds dollar reserves, every oil trade settled in dollars, every country that cannot access the global financial system because Washington has said so, all of it traces back to one arrangement made by two men in 1974. Understanding that arrangement is not optional. It is the minimum necessary knowledge for understanding why the world's money works the way it does, why America's power is what it is, and why the next 20 years, as that arrangement faces its most serious challenge, will look the way they will. That is the petrodollar. That is the secret deal that built American power. And now you know it. Thank you for watching Macro Atlas. Subscribe. The next biography is already being written.